Sponsored by Rabbi Shlomi and Mirla Greenwald. This is a Sicha from Likutei Sichos, Chelek Gimmel, Parshas Behaalosecha, Sicha Alef. And the topic of the Sicha is that in this week's Parsha we learned the pasuk of Uveyom Simchaschem, Uvemayadechem, Uveroshei Chodshechem, Uskaitem B'chatzeisreis, Alaseichem V'alzivchei Shalmechem, V'hayu Lochem L'zikaron Lifnei Elokeichem Ani Hashem Elokeichem. And we learn two teachings of Rashi on it, and there are 5 parts in the Sicha. The Rebbe will, number 1, ask 9 questions on these 2 teachings of Rashi. Number 2, present the key to answering the questions. Number 3, based on this, answer all 9 questions. Number 4, present the detail in Rashi in Pnimiyus Inyanim. And number 5, present understanding of the discussed psukim, because there's also a previous pasuk that will be discussed in the Sicha. And so we'll present understanding of the discussed psukim in Avodas Hashem. From the pasuk in our parsha, Uveyom Simchaschem, Uvemayadechem, Uveroshei Chodshechem, Uskaitem B'chatzeisreis, Alaseichem V'alzivchei Shalmechem, V'hayu Lochem L'zikaron Lifnei Elokeichem Ani Hashem Elokeichem. So Rashi quotes the words Alaseichem, and he explains B'karban tzibur hakosav medaber, that the kos of the pasuk is talking about a karban tzibur when it says Alaseichem. And there are 3 questions here on this Rashi. And just to point out before I start that I wasn't very clear about what the 3 questions are, and so I'm going to explain them according to my understanding. So the first question is that l'cha'ira, apparently, seemingly, it should be enough for Rashi to just say b'karban tzibur, and there's no need to add hakasav medaber, and we'll still know that it's also referring to zivchei shalmechem, even though Rashi doesn't quote from the pasuk al Olaseichem v'gomer to also tell us that it's referring to zivchei shalmechem. Still, we would know that it's referring to zivchei shalmechem as well. So why does Rashi have to say b'karban tzibur and then add hakasav medaber? The second question is, how does Rashi know in Pshutei Shel Mikra that the pasuk is talking about a karban tzibur and not a karban yochid? Now, some Mefarshim say that the proof of Rashi is, like it says in the Sifri and the Gemara, it's from a hekesh from the karban shlomim in this pasuk. However, it's explained over there in the Sifri and the Gemara. However, as we explained many times, Rashi explains everything that's needed for Pshutei Shel Mikra, and he doesn't rely on what's written in the Sifri and the Gemara. And so if that's what Rashi had in mind, he would have explained it. He would have said what the proof is, or at the very least, he would have written like it says in the Sifri and the Gemara. And from the fact that he doesn't do this, he doesn't bring the teaching from the Sifri, he doesn't refer to the teaching in the Sifri, that indicates that it's not his proof. So the question is, what is the proof? How does Rashi know in Pshutei Shel Mikra that the pasuk is talking about a karban tzibur? And the third question is, according to the above, that we don't learn that it's talking about a karban tzibur from something else, because then Rashi would have said it. But rather, it must be that we learn it from the pasuk itself, and like Rashi says, the hakasav medaber, the pasuk is talking about a karban tzibur. So the question is, what's the proof from the pasuk itself? Afterwards, Rashi quotes from the pasuk Ani Hashem Elokeichem, and he explains Mikan Lomadnu. From here we learned Malchus im Zichronis v'Shofars, that there's Malchus with Zichronis and Shofars. How do we learn it? Shanemar Uskaitem. It says Uskaitem in the pasuk Harei Shofars. It says L'Zikaron Harei Zichronis. It says at the end Ani Hashem Elokeichem, so Harei Malchus. So we learn from here that Malchus go together with Zichronis v'Shofars, and Rashi concludes V'chulu. And there are 6 questions here, and the Rebbe divides them into 2 sets of questions of 3. So we're going to do first 3 questions and then the other 3. The first question is, like we spoke many times, it's not the way of Rashi, who explains Pshutei Shel Mikra, to teach halachas that Razal expounded and learned from the pasuk. But rather, he only brings teachings of Razal that are needed for understanding Pshutei Shel Mikra. And so the question over here is, what is missing in our understanding of the pasuk that because of this thing that's missing, Rashi has to bring this teaching of halacha that we have Malchus together with Zechronis and Shofars. The second question is, and this is a continuation of the first question, v'yaseirim, more than what we just said. The meaning of the pasuk is simple. It is a tzivui, l'skoya b'chatzitzres, to blow the chatzitzres, and through that, it'll be that the Yidden are remembered before Hashem. And Rashi comes and explains it not like it is kipshotei. That when it says uskaitem, it refers to shofars, and when it says zikaron, it refers to zechreinis. So that's in regards to the first part of the pasuk, where it says uskaitem b'chatzitzres and v'hayu lechem l'zikaron, which is understood very simply that through uskaitem there'll be that the Yidden will be remembered. And the same thing applies similarly with the end of the pasuk, where it says Ani Hashem Elokeichem. Rashi already explained to us in Parshas Ve'ero that when it says Ani Hashem, it means Ne'eman l'shalom sachar tov, that Hashem is trusted to reward. And Rashi over there says that's what it means in other places as well when it says Ani Hashem. So according to that, we could say the same thing in our pasuk as well. When it says Ani Hashem Elokeichem, it means Ne'eman l'shalom sachar. And so the question over here is as well, why does Rashi explain it differently and in a way that's not pshut l'shel mikra at all, that it's referring to psukei malchus? So the first and second question are asking, why does Rashi bring this pirush, especially since the pirush of the pasuk is understood simply. So Rashi doesn't give us the simple pirush of the pasuk, and then he brings a not simple explanation of the pasuk. And the third question is, Rashi only quotes the words Ani Hashem Elokeichem over here, but he also explains the words uskaitem and lezikaron, that they refer to shofars and zechreinis. So according to this, Rashi should have quoted those words as well, or he should have explained them beforehand in their own dibur maschal, that uskaitem refers to shofars and lezikaron refers to zechreinis. There are another three diyukim in Rashi. Number one, why doesn't Rashi first write Dorshu Rabbeinu or V'chayetzavas as something similar to this, like he does whenever the pasuk is not understood in Pshuta Shamikra and he has to bring a drasha? Rashi says Dorshu Rabbeinu. How come Rashi over here doesn't say Dorshu Rabbeinu or something similar to that? The second diyuk is, what's Rashi hinting to with the v'chulu at the very end of his pirush? What's he hinting to with this? And another part of this diyuk is, why doesn't Rashi explain what it is that he's hinting to? From the fact that he brings it, that indicates that it's relevant to his explanation. So why doesn't he actually explain what it is that he's hinting to? So number one, what is he hinting to? And number two, why is it that he only hints to it and doesn't explain it fully? And the third diyuk is, Rashi in Parshas Emer says on the pasuk over there that it's referring to psukei zechreinis and psukei shofars. So why over here does Rashi change from what he writes over there, and he just writes plainly zechreinis and shofars, and he doesn't use the word psukei? Now we're going to move on to the key of the Sicha, and the key of the Sicha is to answer a general question on this pasuk. And once we answer that question, then we'll be able to move on and understand the two Rashis and answer the questions on the Rashis. So the explanation of all of this will be understood by first presenting another question. We spoke many times that the way of Rashi and the Torah is to explain anything which is unclear in Pshuta Shemikra. So according to this, we have to understand over here, why doesn't Rashi explain the meaning of the words Uviyom Simchaschem at the very beginning of our pasuk? Which day of Simcha is the pasuk talking about? Because we can't explain that it's referring to Moyadim LaSimcha, which are the Yomim Tevim, because those are mentioned right afterwards. It says Uviyom Simchaschem Uvemayadechem, and they're mentioned with a Vav HaMaisif, meaning that we're now moving on to something else. We're moving on to the Moyadim. So that means beforehand we were not talking about the Yomim Tevim. We're not talking about the Moyadim. Now, in Sifri, it explains that when it says of Yom Simchaschem, it means Elo Shabbosis. These refer to Shabbos. However, if that's what Rashi meant, if so, Rashi should have explained it. Rashi should tell us of Yom Chaschem Elu Shabbosis. And also, it's not just that Rashi didn't explain it, Rashi actually can't explain it this way. Since we don't find the idea of Simcha on Shabbos, that it should therefore be called Uviyem Simchaschem. And then it would be especially a problem when it's written near Uvemayadechem, and specifically Shabbos, which we don't find ever that it's called Simcha, is called Uviyem Simchaschem, and not the Yomim Tevim that are called days of Simcha, but then they're only referred to as Mayadechem. So it can be like the Sifri that it's talking about Shabbos. And to point out that even al derech ha'halacha, this isn't a simple matter to connect Shabbos to Simcha. And we also can say, this is a side point, that when it says of a Yom Simchaschem, it's a person's personal Simcha, since Rashi explains that when it says Olaseichem, it's Bekarben Sibur, it's a public thing, not a personal thing. And therefore, because Rashi doesn't say anything over here, we must say that according to Rashi, it's self-understood. Because Rashi explains anything that's unclear in Pshat Mikra. And if something is unclear and Rashi doesn't have an answer, he'll say, Eini Yedea, I don't know. And if something's unclear and he doesn't say anything, and he doesn't say Eini Yedea, that means that either it's understood based on something we explained earlier, or it's self-understood. And so in this case, we're going to have to say that it's self-understood. And the explanation is, in the previous pasuk, right before this pasuk of Uvayim Simchaschem, it says, V'chisavayu milchama, there'll be a battle, V'arei you should blow the chatzitz race, V'niskartem, V'neshaitem ma'yveichem, you'll be safe from your enemies. And in continuation to this, our pasuk says, Uviyem Simchaschem, with a vav achibur. It's continuing from the previous pasuk, meaning that this pasuk comes in continuation to the previous pasuk. So according to this, it's understood simply that Uviyem Simchaschem refers to a Yom Simcha that the Yidden will make after V'neshaitem, after they are saved from their enemies. They're going to make it to thank and praise Hashem for being saved from their enemies. So that's the meaning of the first words of our pasuk. Uvayim Simchaschem, it refers to the time that when the Yidden are V'neshaitem ma'yveichem, when they're safe from their enemies. And now we're going to move on to the main point of the answer and answering questions 1, 2, and 3 that were all about the first Rashi of Bekarben Sibur HaKosav Medaber. According to this, it's understood very simply the proof that Olaseichem is a Karben Sibur, since everything in these psukim are matters of a tzibur. Everything in these psukim are about a tzibur. So it's understood that also the continuation of the pasuk, when it says Al Olaseichem, it's Bekarben Sibur, HaKosav Medaber. This pasuk is talking about matters of a tzibur. From the beginning, from Uvayim Simchaschem, that's referring to when the Yidden being saved from their enemies as a tzibur. And when it says HaKosav Medaber, it refers to Zivchei Shalmeichem. So the way it answers the first three questions, again, when it came to the first three questions, I did not fully understand them, but my understanding of it over here is that the reason why it says HaKosav Medaber, it seems like there's two parts to it. Number one, the whole pasuk is talking about Uvayim Simchaschem. It's talking about a time of something related to the tzibur. Uvayim Simchaschem, Uvemayadechem, Uvereshechem. These are all days of tzibur. From the beginning of Yom Simchaschem, like we just said in the key to the Sicha. The Rebbe says clearly in the Sicha that a Kosav Medaber also refers to Zivchei Shalmeichem. In regards to what's the source that the pasuk is talking about a Karben Sibur, because the whole pasuk, the whole discussion over here is about a Karben Sibur. So of course, also the Olaseichem is a Karben Sibur. And specifically, how is the pasuk itself a proof for this? So again, it's because the topic of the pasuk is something of a tzibur. Now we're going to move on to answering questions 4, 5, 6, 7, and 9. So the only question we're not going to answer right now, we're going to answer afterwards, is question 8. So according to this explanation, that our pasuk comes in continuation to the previous pasuk, so it's understood that we can't explain the Ani Hashem Elokeichem that's written here to mean what it means in other places, that Nem al Shalom Sachar. Since the previous pasuk already says that Hashem will give schar. It says over there that through Vareis and Bachatzeitzres, then there will be V'neshaitem ma'yveichem. And therefore the question is, what does Ani Hashem Elokeichem teach us? Not what's the meaning of the words, but what does it teach us, since it can't be learned the way it's usually learned. And therefore Rashi explains that the extra words, Ani Hashem Elokeichem, come to teach us a halacha. because there's no need for these words. What they mean we know, but why are they written? They're not written to tell us Neman L'Shalom Sachar, because we know that already. So why were they written here? And that's why Rashi writes Mikan Lomadanu, meaning to say that he's not explaining the words Ani Hashem Elokeichem, because their meaning is simple, but rather to explain what we learn out for them because they're extra. So the meaning of the words we know, but there's no need for these words to be written to teach us Neman L'Shalom Sachar, because we know that already. So what are they teaching us? And Rashi continues, Malchis im zichrenis v'shofros shenemar uskatam harei shofros l'zikaron harei zichrenis ani Hashem Elokeichem harei malchis. And his intent is not to explain that when it says uskaitem goimel l'zikaron is psukim, the psukim of shofros and the psukim of zichrenis, which is the opposite of the simple meaning. That's not what the psukim mean. The psukim mean exactly what they seem to be saying, that the Yidden will blow the Chatzotz race and they'll be remembered. But rather, what Rashi is saying is because the pasuk adds here, Ani Hashem Elokeichem, it teaches us that when there are shofros and zichrenis, we need to add malchus to them. So this is already answering a lot of the questions. One of our questions was, it's not the way of Rashi to teach halachas that Razal learned from the pasuk. He's not teaching us a pasuk that's learned from a halacha that's learned from the pasuk. He's addressing the extra words over here. So it's not the meaning of the pasuk. And that was the next question. The meaning of the pasuk is simple. Rashi is not changing the meaning of the pasuk. Then we also asked, Rashi only quotes the words Ani Hashem Elokeichem. What about the words that he's explaining, Uskaitem L'Zikaron? The explanation is that he's not coming to tell us the meaning of those words. Rashi is only addressing the fact that there's the extra words over here, Ani Hashem Elokeichem, and what we can learn out of it for elsewhere, not the meaning of the psukim. And that's also why Rashi doesn't say Dorshu Rabbeinu, because he's not darshaning this pasuk to mean anything different than the simple meaning. And then we'll also address why Rashi doesn't say Psukei Zichrenis and Psukei Shofros. He doesn't use the word Psukei. So Rashi is just telling us that what we learn from the extra words is that whenever there are Shofros and Zichrenis, we have to add Malchus to them. That just like in this pasuk where it says Uskaitem and L'Zikaron, it adds Ani Hashem Elokeichem, which is Malchus, which we said shouldn't be written here. So too whenever there are Shofros and Zichrenis, so one also has to. There also has to be over there Malchus. Just like over here, look, the pasuk adds the words Ani Hashem Elokeichem, which are not needed. It adds it to tell us that whenever there are Zichrenis and Shofros, you have to add Malchus. And that's why Rashi doesn't say Psuki Zichrenis or Psuki Shofros, since he's not referring to Psukim, because in our pasuk it's not talking about Psuki Zichrenis and Psuki Shofros. So Rashi is not going to mention anything about Psukim, because our pasuk is not talking about Psuki Zichrenis and Psuki Shofros. It just mentions Uskaitim, which is Shofros. It mentions L'Zikaron, which is Zichrenis. And then the pasuk goes and adds Ani Hashem Elokeichem, which seems extra. So it's teaching us that whenever you have Zichrenis and Shofros, nothing to do with Psuki Zichrenis and Psuki Shofros, because our pasuk is not talking about Psuki Zichrenis and Psuki Shofros. You also have to add Malchias, Ani Hashem Elokeichem. And then the Rebbe continues and says, in another signon, also Rashi learns, it's another way of explaining what we just said. Also Rashi learns the Psukim simply, that through Uskaitim will be Zikaron. But we just need to understand the extra words, Ani Hashem Elokeichem. Why are they written? So Rashi is not changing the understanding of the pasuk, that the pasuk is telling us something about Malchus, Zichrenis, and Shofros. But rather the pasuk means to say what it's saying. And the extra words, Ani Hashem Elokeichem, teach us that, look, when we have Zichrenis and Shofros, we need to add Malchus, because we have in our pasuk the idea of Shofros and Zichrenis, and it adds at the end, Ani Hashem Elokeichem, which is the idea of Malchus. Now we're going to move on to answer question number 8. A Talmud Memulach may ask, why does Rashi switch the order from the way it is in the pasuk? And Rashi says, first Malchus, then Zichrenis, and then Shofros, and that's also how it is in the davening of Rosh Hashanah. First Malchus, then Zichrenis, and then Shofros. Why does he switch it when the order in the pasuk is the total opposite? It's first Shofros, then Zichrenis, and then Malchus. And in order to answer this question, Rashi concludes with V'chulu. So before we see the answer, this already answers our 8th question. The question was, why does Rashi write V'chulu? What is it that he's hinting to? And why does he only hint to it and not say it clearly? So the answer is, what he's hinting to is why we have this change in the order in Rashi and in the Tefillah and Rosh Hashanah from the way it is in the pasuk. And the reason he only hints to it is because this is a question of a Talmud Memulach. And since it's not the question of every student, Rashi doesn't actually say the answer clearly, he just hints to it. So with this, by saying v'chulu, Rashi is referring to the continuation in the Sifri that actually says this very question and gives an answer. It says, Im kain, if so, if this is the order in the pasuk, Maro chachamim leimer malchus tchilo, v'achgach zechronis, v'achgach shefus. What did the chachamim see that made them say that we should first say malchus first before everything else, and then zechronis, and then shefus? And they explained, because hamlichu alecha tchilo, first make Hashem a king over you. That's the first thing. V'achakach bakish rachamim ulfanov, kedei shetizacher lo. Then ask Hashem for mercy, for compassion, that He should remember you. Uvameh b'shofar, and all of that is done through shofar. And therefore, when Rashi brings a halacha from the Chachamim, which that's what this is over here, it's a halacha from the Chachamim, he also brings it in this order, in the order that the Chachamim established that it should be done. So we can explain in Pnimis Inyanim the change of what is learned out from what the order in the pasuk is in as follows. It's explained in regards to Malchus, Zechronis, and Shofris that Shofris is the level of Bina, Zechronis is the level of Zah, and Malchus is the level of Malchus. So in the Torah, the order is Melmaila Lamata, because the Torah is Amshacha Melmaila Lamata. But in Avodah Sa'adam, the order is Melmata Lamaila, because that's the Avodah of a person, Melmata Lamaila. And now we're going to move on to explain these psukim in Avodah Adam. So the explanation of the psukim in Avodah Adam is as follows. The previous pasuk starts off Kisavayu Milchama. So that hints to the constant war, the Milchama with the Yitzhahara, who, as the pasuk continues and says, is Hatzor Eschem. He's the one that we're always having battle against, especially in the time of davening, which, as we learn, that the time of davening is a time of battle. And the pasuk teaches us the advice to win this battle is V'arei Oisem Bachat Tzeitzreis, which that represents in Avodah Adam the leiv nishbar v'nitke, the broken heart, the bittul v'achana, the humility and the brokenheartedness, that one should beg Hashem to help them in their battle, and through this, through that a person has a broken heart and they beg Hashem to help them, then there will be v'niskartem lifnei Hashem Elokeichem v'nishaitem evechem. Hashem will remember the person, and the person will be saved from their enemy. And we continue and say, maybe a person will think to themselves, this Avodah of Leiv Nishbar V'Nitke and the Bittul Nachana is necessary at the start of one's Avodah, when one's Yitzhahara is in its full force. But after winning the battle and being saved from one's enemy, and one is already serving Hashem in a way of Tam V'Das, they relate to it, they understand it, it becomes part of the way that they understand and think and their whole perspective and mindset, and one also has pleasure in it, then one doesn't need the Bittul Nachana. So the pasuk teaches us that also v'yem simchaschem gamer uskaitem b'chatzeitzreis Olaseichem v'alzivchei shalmechem gamer. That even after winning the battle, at the time of bringing karbanis, it's already yem simchaschem. It's a time of karbanis, coming close to Hashem. Even then, there must be uskaitem, the bittul and achna. And in the bringing of karbanis, the pasuk says the order is al Olaseichem and then v'alzivchei shalmechem. The first one has to bring Olaseichem, the carbon oila, which the carbon oilos, those are completely for Hashem. And in Avodah Adam, this is the total bittul of a person to Hashem. And only afterwards, one brings shalmechem, which is the avodah of coming close to Hashem in a way of tam v'das, of understanding, similar to a carbon shlomim, that the owners also have pleasure from it, because they also get to eat from it. So we're saying that also when one is already close to Hashem, there has to be the uskaitem b'chatzeitzreis, which is the bittul and achana, and it's not just that, it's also there. The order is that it's first, and then comes the connection of Tam and Das, and that's reflected in the oila, which is entirely for Hashem, which that's the bittul and achna, and the shlomim, which the owners also eat from, which is the connection of the person to the aveda. And more generally, carbon oila is like aveda satfila, that a person goes up and attaches themselves to Hashem. And carbon shlomim, which is eaten by the owner, is like the avodah sa'adam, while being occupied with one's material matters throughout the day, when it must be kol ma'asecha l'shem shamayim and b'chol derchecha de'eyu. So on a more general level, until now we're talking about davening, and when a person has to beg Hashem, or when a person is coming close to Hashem, there still has to be the brokenheartedness. More generally, the carbon oila represents avodah satfila, when a person is being oila, going up like a carbon oila to Hashem. And Karban Shlomim, which we said is the Bailam also eat from it, that's when a person is engaged and involved and occupied with their own personal matters, Ma'asecha and Rachecha, and there the Avodah, the carbon part is that it should be L'Shem Shamayim and De'eyu. And the Pasuk is hinting that the order is that the Karban Eilu comes before the Karban Shlomim, because it's forbidden for a person to be involved in their personal matters before Tefillah. That's Allah and Shulchan Aruch. And Rashi emphasizes even more. He says, when it says Alaleiseichem bekorban tzibur hakasav medaber, it's not enough for a person's avodah and tefillah and bittul to be a avodas yachid. It's a person's own thing, but rather one must include themselves with the tzibur. And especially we say that tefillah harabim hi ritzuya yoser lefnei hamakim, that it's specifically the tefillah of a rabbim that's wanted and desirable in front of Hashem. So we see that also the avodah of tefillah, the bittul of the avodas yachid, has to be with the rabbim.